You can go ahead and start the video. All right, well, thank you everyone for being here with us today. My name is Anjali Patel. I'm the Executive Director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Business. We're very excited to be hosting this with you. We're gathered here to unpack the results of the Q3 2025 Global Risk Index. And one of the most striking findings this time is that the Global Risk Advisory Council has ranked targeting by or criticism from Donald Trump as the #1 reputational risk facing companies today. What's driving this? We'll discuss this a little bit further, but I'm going to put 3 words at you: amplified accountability convergence. It's a term that I think we'll dive into a little bit, and I'll have Brett discuss that with us a little bit. So just keep that in mind, but essentially a number of forces that are happening politically, technologically, that are amplifying traditional reputation risks. And that's what's driving a lot of it. So a single social media post can trigger an entire crisis before a company even has a chance to prepare or even respond. And so today we're joined by the chair of the Global Risk Advisory Council and former administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration, Isabel Guzman, as well as the president and CEO of the Global Situation Room, Brett Bruen, to help us unpack today's results. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, so I'm going to jump right in because I know everyone in this room, folks online, are dying to unpack and ask questions. So the first thing I want to ask you, Isabel, is that you opened the report by saying that the political rhetoric coming from the president has reached a tipping point where it's no longer political rhetoric, but has reputational risk effects, creating a whole new category. So what's changed between Q2 and Q3 that's elevated this risk to #1?
I think it's more that the president has been able to leverage his platform, whether that's on Truth Social or out in the media marketplace, as well as his political levers through executive order, et cetera, action, to be able to use that power to target specific companies into action, to advance policy that he's interested in. And so I think. But the uncertainty of that, the haphazard nature of it, whether that's calling out companies to fire certain executives or going after specific challenges, that's as we were discussing previously, like that's an ability to come in and influence the market. And it's not traditional. I mean, normally we talk about these oversight bodies of government or the regulatory environment, but this is instead a single individual that could really have an impact, on your specific brand, your executive's brand, organizationally, et cetera. And so that's what's shifted. Is I think it's just this perfect storm of where we are with AI, deepfakes, technology, as well as social media influencers and of course this full power over, and authority over agencies to be able to deploy and take action, like the FCC in the case of, Kimmel, et cetera.
I mean, it's a fascinating time, and you mentioned some of the factors that are kind of elevating, this risk to number one versus one and Q2. Maybe Brett, I can ask you this question. When we were talking, you had mentioned something called the amplified accountability, convergence. Could you just tell us quickly what that means and why is that important now?
Certainly, and I'll start with the point that the antidote for today's risks and also jet lag is coffee. So make sure that both those online and those here get plenty of coffee. I think to build on what Isabel was saying, it comes down to, yes, we went through this once before. And we saw some of the color commentary at times, but now it's different. And it's even different than it was 6 months ago, a year ago, in that Trump is not just, stream of consciousness pouring out onto social media. He's also taking action. But as we were talking about yesterday at CBS, he is also being influenced and in many cases driven. These risks are being driven by MAGA influencers who look at John's Barbecue offering a Hispanic Heritage Month celebration saying, oh, wait, that is discriminatory. And so I think we're in an environment where, yes, there is the reputational risk, but that is converging with the revenue risk. And that is why, if we get to the crux, the core, we were just talking on the drive over about former Vice President Kamala Harris's comments here in San Francisco this week on corporate executives and their acquiescence to some of the things that Trump has been doing. Well, they're doing it because it's not just a temporary reputation hit, it's a revenue hit. And this is where I think, the index is really interesting in identifying that these days, your reputation hit does directly, in most cases, result in stock dips. It results in more regulatory scrutiny, as well as obviously the revenue hit as well.
Well, I think there's also a kind of, this is, quite focused on Donald Trump and what his perceptions are in the US. But so many of these risks might even have a different impact, globally speaking, perhaps in different governments and folks that may not see eye to eye with Donald Trump, regulatorily speaking. So maybe we can dive into that a little bit. But I wanted to go a little bit further into what you're saying around executives. Let's look at the Intel case study, because I think that is nicely highlighted in the report itself. And essentially, to keep it short, the CEO had to resign or had some ties with Chinese government. This drew scrutiny from Donald Trump, resulted in a stock dip, kind of put them in a financially vulnerable position, necessitating in some ways this 10% stake that now the US government has over Intel. To say one-to-one, all of these cause the next thing, maybe that one can debate all of that, but Brett, what does this tell us? I mean, I think what's very interesting is there's a story here. What does it tell us about the calculus that these executives need to be making? And does this level of government involvement in a company, is it a precedent or is it a one-off?
Well, Isabel and I were chatting about, okay, well, what's different about this than, for instance, when the US government intervened in the case of General Motors? I mean, we famously said in the Obama administration, bin Laden is dead and GM lives. And so you do obviously have precedent for the government intervention. In this case, and I think in several others, NVIDIA, the 15% payment that they have to make for continuing their presence in the Chinese market, all of these have a bit of a different feature, which is, on the one hand, it seems as though the president, his administration are picking favorites. They're saying, well, I'm going to intervene with you, Intel, or I'm going to allow you, NVIDIA, as long as you give me a cut of it, to stay in Chinese market. And obviously, and it comes down to concerns that have been raised just about the free market and what is in fact this Trump 2.0 version of capitalism. Because, you know, those of us who studied, you know, have a master's in global economic history, which in this case is quite useful to be able to say, this isn't the notion of Adam Smith. This isn't the notion of our founders of a free economy. And so I think this quarter's report really raises some hard questions about what kind of economy do we want? What kind of relationship between businesses and government do we want? And is what we've seen in the case of Intel, in the case of NVIDIA, in the case even of Microsoft and Goldman Sachs, are we going to allow this to continue? Or I guess more specifically, will Republicans on Capitol Hill allow this to continue? Or are they going to intervene and say, you know what, as they did in the case of, you know, Brendan Carr and the FCC, with Ted Cruz of all people coming out and saying, you know, enough. We don't want the government deciding what is and is not funny.
Well, this is very fascinating because, you know, there are examples of governments owning parts of strategic industries in foreign countries. France is a great example of this. And I think the question you're highlighting of what kind of economy do we want to have in the US is kind of at the brink of this question, in this moment. So, very much something to monitor, I guess, as whether this is something that will continue to happen. Do you see any instances where there'll be other industries or other companies that may need to be thinking about their financial performance as a potential reason for why Donald Trump may be taking a look at a strategic industry?
Well, I mean, and I think, you know, it's collaboration between business and government, and these public-private partnerships is vital to continue to advance critical industries. We want leadership, and especially in chips. And so to be able to, you know, make sure that the government is continuing those investments in strengthening our manufacturing in the US is important. So, you know, that's why, you know, you have this instance, but I think it's more of the, you know, haphazardness, the targeting, that there's some sort of, you know, tinge with, you know, picking winners and losers. That's where this differs from what our free economy is based on, and where we want to see, you know, certainty and regulation. We want to understand, and especially for, you know, from my perspective, for small businesses and startups, like I think being able to, you know, to compete in that level playing field is just core to our ability to continue to be on the cutting edge of innovation as well. And so I think that's what the challenge is. You know, having ran the, you know, the small business investment company portfolio at the SBA, which had in the past taken equity stake in companies, debt and equity, you know, within those funds, you know, I'm personally not opposed to the government playing a role in being able to allow for equity and debt investment. Sometimes you need that for those, especially for innovations that require this long tail investment. And so, you know, but I do think it's in collaboration. It's in, you know, a strong strategic conversations, and not just haphazard from a Truth Social tweet to a few days later, a negotiation.
CHIPS Act funding being held back.
Held back, right.
Yes, yeah.
Being
No.
held hostage. And so, but I do think, you know, there's an important role for business and government to play in collaboration to ensure leadership.
Yeah, and I mean, I, again, personally as a lawyer, can get very nerdy about what does it mean to have government as a shareholder, so I want to know that.
Yes, yes.
But I want to get a little further into some of the findings that we've had. So, let's talk about fraud risk, because that's number 2 on this, on the index this year. Fraud allegations are number 2, with about 60% of the council rating it at an 8 or higher, which I would love for you to explain why that's significant. But I want to also bring in some other important notes here, that even unproven accusations can have lasting damage, which I think that's where we get very nervous. So could you just expand a little bit on that?
So I would first say watch this space, because as the wheels of the economy start to slow and to squeak, there will be more scrutiny around business practices. There's going to be more scrutiny on tariffs and how much are companies pocketing versus, you know, passing on or doing, quote unquote, as Trump has urged them, their share to contribute to easing the pain. And as you point out, and I think it's worthwhile to underline, it's not just, you have been found guilty in the court of law and, therefore you have committed fraud. It is the mere appearance or allegation of it, which is the risk. And so really being quite careful in terms of how can we be more transparent on pricing, transparent on our business practices, so that there is beyond a shadow of a doubt, no question where if questions are raised, we're able to point to, we call it informational infrastructure. You can point to, all right, you have questions about how did we arrive at this price increase? This is what went into it. And I mean, I did a interesting conversation with the corner office columnist at the New York Times, where, she was trying to understand how CEOs are navigating their earnings call, where they have to acknowledge our, earnings are down, our prices are up because of tariffs. But if they do that, Trump is going to come down on them, as the top risk says, like a ton of bricks. And so how do you ensure you're being transparent, ensure that you're being honest with investors and shareholders and consumers, but at the same time, avoid that specter of Trump attacking you, investigating you even, because we're seeing that play out.
And I do think the consumer oversight of companies, in essence, by their market decisions, really matter especially when you're talking about reputation risks. And companies that just focus on government regulation or are missing most of the conversation, and obviously that's what they should be focused on. But I think fraud, and of course I lived the dialogue around fraud during the pandemic relief. SBA, with deploying $1.2 trillion in relief, had to face fraud in the marketplace with that fast delivery in 2020. You would think by the basis of the news coverage, PPP was all fraud. $1.2 trillion dispersed is probably 37 billion in likely fraud. And they're still litigating most of it and will for another several years. But the perception was that it was all fraud, and to the detriment of these programs into the future. What will be the appetite of American taxpayers and voters for future programs to help support small businesses in a crisis like this, if they deem it to be mostly fraud? And that you saw those accusations with Doge, coming in, that there was rampant fraud at SBA. They were going to discover, of course, none discovered, because the programs had been course corrected in 2021, so that you had speed and certainty, not just speed. And fraud was actually within acceptable norms versus the private sector. And I think the narrative on fraud can just so quickly get away from you. It didn't matter what we said, what we released in terms of data and analysis. The narrative was there, and once it's out there, it's gone, because people usually have this underlying sense that they're being screwed somehow, somewhere. And so whether that's all the top risks, fraud, corporate ethics, data control. I mean, all these issues have that personal tinge of like, what are you doing taking advantage in the situation?
Well, one of the, as we're talking about this, and I'm hearing loud and clear that there are not just factually provable risks, but then there are the perception of those provable risks. So if you are not being corrupt, but there's information out there, perhaps fake information, you need to manage that. Where is this happening though? Is it in like the New York Times? Is it on Facebook? Where are we going to find these conversations? And if I'm like a chief marketing officer or a chief communications officer or a chief legal officer, I want to know where to go. And it sounds like there's no single place to go to find where all this is happening. So what's your advice? Where can one monitor all of this?
I mean, I think it starts with social media. And one of the things that we say, which, takes me back to that Navajo weather rock, where, the guide alongside it says, well, if it's wet, it's probably raining. If it's swinging, it's probably windy. You got to do a better job in the 21st century and in times of Trump of monitoring your risks. So it's about the atmospherics, about understanding not just have they mentioned my company, have they mentioned my industry, But, we talk about it in terms of what's the focus of your most likely adversaries, what's the frequency with which they're focused on that issue, and then lastly, what's the ferocity with which they're focused on the issue. So if I see, for instance, that groups that are particularly agitated, for instance, around allegations of fraud are starting to focus on consumer products. If I am a consumer products company, that probably puts me on a heightened state of awareness, and I want to be checking more closely. But also, I think these days we're seeing the power of video. And so, you ask, okay, what is the tipping point? What's the inflection point? It is often when I see in the moment, there's a video out circulating of some employee engaged in some act of inappropriate behavior. That's going to start setting off, red flags for me of, hey, as a company, I need to engage, and I need to engage quickly. I think the challenge, and we saw this in the case of ABC, was how slowly they responded. And what does that do? It allows a narrative to set hold. It allows, and we can debate, and I've had these debates with lawyers in terms of what is legally sound, but reputationally stupid. And so, I often will point to, not to like throw the lawyers under the plane, but the case of Dr. Dow on United Airlines, where they put out that statement, we have reaccommodated Dr. Dow as he was physically dragged off the plane. Legally, probably the lawyer was on solid ground. Reputationally, not the right thing to say. And so, thinking about how do you strike that right balance? Because again, coming back to the times, the unique times in which we live, it isn't enough simply to say, well, legally, we would expect a federal administration to not investigate us because there's not a foundation here. It, in fact, very much depends on what is the social media temperature around this, what are those influencers saying. And so, yes, take on board, obviously, would never suggest that no one, not heed their lawyer's advice. But I actually think the lawyers at the White House had it right when they uniquely, in my government experience, would tell us, we're not here to tell you not to do something. We're here to show you how you can do it. So really pushing your lawyers, your general counsels to say, show me how I can do it, because I know that I need to lean in this moment. I know I need to be a little bit more proactive. So how can I make that possible?
And I do think you're getting to something in terms of like, what is the news cycle and how things linger online, and you can't rush to action just based on one online article. Like, it really has to start to resonate across the media landscape. But I do think that all these risks are a great reminder to executives and organizations that they need to first and foremost get in touch with their values, understand from a corporate perspective what their position is, and what resonates most with that trusted relationship with their consumers ultimately, and stand by that so that you can be more responsive in the moment and quick to respond if you've done that pre-work to whatever the risk may be.
Yeah, and I think we can get into some of the solutions in a little bit, but I wanted to quickly notice something between Q2 and Q3, which is actually a couple of risks have completely dropped off. Some that I think are pretty important. So I'm actually curious to hear your rationale around this. Things like disinformation, corruption, climate change, and China ties, which in my head bring like risk, right? Like it's like a very important, these are important topics. But then there's new ones that you've added into the list. Elon Musk Association, which I think we used to laugh about this and it was a funny thing, but now it sounds like there's actually some meat and impact from this risk. So what has shifted, and why are we seeing Elon Musk Association elevate to such a high level while disinformation, corruption, climate change, China ties, risks like those have disappeared? Does that mean that they're no longer important, or what's going on there?
Well, part of what you're seeing also is not that they are any less important, but that when it comes to, for instance, Donald Trump's direct targeting of companies, that's just grown in importance. We're seeing a greater quantity in that space. I think also in some cases, like with China, we've actually seen a dialing down of the temperature. So while Trump came into office saying, hey, any thing, associated with Beijing bad. Now he's engaging in these trade negotiations. He's opening up options for NVIDIA, for other companies. So, and this is what I think is particularly challenging for our team, is they're out looking every day and saying, okay, what's popping up on our radar in terms of instances in which companies, executives are getting pulled out. We're culling all of that, and then we're pulling it into a list that the Global Risk Advisory Council gets and says, okay, here's where the most attention was, but now we want your perspective on what is it that you're seeing where you sit. And so, from week to week, let alone quarter to quarter, these things are shifting dramatically. Elon Musk actually in the first quarter was one of, I think it was risk number 2. So he's been there. What I think we're seeing now is how, as he returns to Tesla, he returns to SpaceX, actually some of the associated baggage, the toxicity perhaps, that accompanied him in his Doge role is now starting to pop up in that role as he returns to his businesses. Perhaps a cautionary tale for some officials who are either in the current administration, others who have affiliation. And this is one of the things which I'm an equal opportunity critic, so I've been critical of Biden in the past. I will level my criticisms at Trump as well. I think if you're a CEO and you're heading into this storm, proceeding with some degree of caution and care, because those that have thrown their lot in so prominently, and I will not name specific CEOs, but those who have gone to the White House, have kissed the ring, have in some cases delivered very shiny gold glass objects to the president, that may in the long term, cost you customers. I think internationally we're seeing how there is blowback against American brands, and that tight tie into Trump and the administration for some companies may be a disincentive for some consumers. So it is a balancing act.
Well, I'm seeing you lead me into the other question, but Isabel, did you want to add?
No, we can keep on going because I want to get to questions too.
Yeah. So one last question, because I know this is a fiery topics here. Building on that point of there's actually reputational risk in capitulating, essentially, is what I'm hearing, to Trump's demands and being targeted by him, right? There's definitely short-term risk if the president is tweeting about you, or I don't know what it's called on Truth Social, but writing about you. Yet you're still seeing companies do this, and so much of this is shaped in part by short-term incentive. That is kind of the best marker, I think, in the world we live in, especially in the market. So what's your framework of when a company should align itself to the president's demands, or when to resist it? And either way, it sounds like there's going to be blowback. So what do we do here? What's the framework?
And I don't think there's a formulaic approach to any of these risks for any company. I think it really depends on the company. But even if you go back to Q1 and some of the risks around DEI, I mean, you saw with varying degrees how companies were treated in the marketplace based on their quick capitulation or staying strong. I mean, some chose to just proceed. Look at a large bank that went from DEI to DOI, I think, in your acronym. But I mean, either way, those who stay true to their values, back to that again, were able to continue strong with their stakeholders. They've been communicating a certain thing, but I just think there's no unique form. That's the challenge. There's no unique formulaic approach. It's just about monitoring and ensuring the response is authentic. And so I think it's really just another exercise in authenticity for corporations, but monitoring and authenticity. But crisis expert.
The one thing I would say, or that I think we've seen, is Trump doesn't really give a damn about the details.
Right.
And so that's a real advantage if you're a CEO. And so at least what we have been suggesting is, how do you co-opt this conversation? Okay, Trump wants to talk about drug prices. And I think, what we saw in the case of Pfizer and their views on multiple sides of this was, okay, well, let's talk about, we are interested as a company, as an industry, in bringing down prices. So you engage with him, you find ways that you can sort of direct his attention to a more constructive context. So that to me is the smart strategy. You don't necessarily just, bend the knee and say, yes, Mr. President, whatever you want. You find a way to pull that attention into a place that both for you as a company, you as an industry, hopefully also more broadly as a country and a global community. And this holds true as well, recovering diplomat, for countries that are facing threats of colonialism, like Greenland. I mean, I've made this point in multiple speeches about how Trump doesn't actually want to invade Greenland. What, the Danes or the Greenlanders would be wise to do is say, you're interested in Arctic security? Great, let's talk about that. Let's start a process. We want to double down on that. And then you go forward in that way, and Trump gets to take a win. He will claim anything as a win, as including losses. So how do you allow yourself to overcome that temporary threat and move to a place that I think is a more constructive space?
And Pfizer is not judged by just that action alone. I mean, that's also something to consider. Like if you do choose a path of taking action with the president, you still have other actions to define your company. And so I think just being very dedicated to that mission.
And I think we've seen that in the legal industry quite a bit. We've faced our fair share of targeting by Trump, and you see the winners and losers over time, even though in the moment it can feel so intense. We'll still see in a year what happens. So maybe we'll back in this room discussing this very exact topic. Final question. I know I said one more, but then we'll open it up to the audience. What should we be looking for in Q4? I know there's a couple of risks that you've already queued up as something to watch. So if you could just share with the audience, what are the top reputational risks that we're not tracking today that we should be, and any solutions or proactive approaches that companies should be taking to prepare for those?
Well, I mean, I think we have to flag AI again. I mean, it's come up multiple times, and in different aspects, it's still in there overwhelmingly. But in this index, we did dive in a little bit more into some of the challenges around AI, whether it's the deep fakes, the potential misuse, mental health issues, or the IP infringement, like all these different factors, are really important, especially because we want to continue to pave our way towards leadership in this area. We are, especially since we're here in the Bay Area, this is an area that we're, want to dominate. And then not only that, we want to continue to see innovation. We want to continue to see the positives, the opportunities out of this. So I do think, tracking AI as a reputational risk, making sure that companies are deploying it properly. It's that trust that's lost sometimes when a chat, when instead of being able to get a live person in customer service, you're just forced into an AI system that frustrates you. And so, that can just lead to backlash unnecessarily. So I think really paying attention to reputation and how you're deploying AI is really important.
Totally agree on the AI. And I think it's an example of how just because in times of Trump, you can do something, as in Trump is, opening up the floodgates for companies, especially here in the Bay Area, to just, do anything and everything when it comes to technology, AI. The real issue, I think, for executives is should you? And not just should you from an ethical standpoint, but we are going to start to see some of the blowback because consumers, regulators in other markets, last quarter, we looked at how Europe has not changed their views. They have an AI Act, which is pretty strong. And so I think it's important to take account of that. The other two that I would call out, one is CEO behavior, and I think that will come under greater scrutiny. We're living in a time where the personal brand is so exposed. And so, if you can get Gwyneth Paltrow as a temporary spokesperson, I thought that was a brilliant example from Astronomer. We talk about it all the time in my crisis comms class, that we, use that moment of oxygen to say, let me tell you about Astronomer and everything you didn't think you needed to know about us.
But didn't save the CEO in that case.
But didn't save the CEO. No, small
Calculated risk.
But the other one, I think that's important to pull in here is that, you know, we are going to see disinformation pop back up. One of those that, you know, last quarter was very high on the list. It's been overtaken by events, but, you know, disinformation as we head into another legislative election period here in the US, we're seeing elections around the world. And those elections, those members of Congress are increasingly just like, you know, the president going after individual companies. They're saying, you know, who to blame for the economic woes. It's not the tariffs. It's not, you know, the lack of government oversight. It is company X or Y. So I would pay close attention to those.
Well, that is just fantastic. I can already tell that the audience has some questions, so let's open it up. Any questions from the folks in the audience?
I think we're gonna go first online because there might be
Oh,
a time
yes.
that we can
I
cut.
think everyone online is maybe submitting some questions now, so if there is anyone in here, we can also.
I have a question based on just a passing comment you made. And so if I'm over indexing on the
Okay, yeah.
comment,
I'd love to clarify.
you said there's sort of this, and it seems like underpinning a lot of what makes a receptive audience is this idea that everybody's getting screwed, right?
Mhm.
Which you've said. How do we think about addressing that on a national scale? And if you put yourself in the role of being in government today, you know, irrespective of the administration, how do you address that? How do you start to change the course? Because if you have this receptive audience, to your point, that really even the allegation then lands because people are open to it, because they have this underlying sense that someone's doing something that's affronting me. How do we course correct as a country?
Yeah, yeah, and I did say it in passing, but I do sincerely, you know, track that. I think, you know, in sports, you see it as well. You know, people always will call out that the ref made a bad call, not, you know, it's not just the game. So, or not that you're doing the same thing on the other side whenever you have the opportunity. So, I do think that that's something that's becoming more and more pervasive. I do think it's our greatest challenge right now, and what, you know, leads to disinformation and what leads to distrust and everything else. You know, and so, you know, I do think more place-based community engagement is where, you know, people have to start to come together more and see eye to eye. I mean, that sounds impossible and plausible, but who knows? I mean, we were just talking about the fact that some future generations are starting to, you know, repulse against social media and phones, and maybe they'll switch this for us. You know, I'm hopeful. But I do think that it takes really intentionality of place-based, very, you know, hands-on, close-knit, you know, interfaces.
But what would leaders do though? I mean, it's all, yeah, I think all
Yeah.
well and good to say we should come together as a community, but like, how do you spark that at a national level?
Well, I mean, I think leaders have to demonstrate that themselves, and we don't have a lot of good examples right now. You know, everyone is the victim and, you know, being attacked, and so and going after those who are attacking. So it's not the best situation on any side, right? And so, but I do think you know, the more people who can stand up and take those, you know, positions and use any social media moment that they have. You know, Governor Cox, as an example, at the very beginning of his response on Charlie Kirk, I mean, just be able to try to take that moment and send a message. That was strong leadership.
And if you could just say your name and your organization would be really helpful.
Sure, Jamie Hine, I'm at Covington Burley. So one thing that didn't come up as much yet is what we're experiencing here and seeing in the United States in terms of, you know, erosion of normal democratic process. You know, I guess I would love the perspective of the panelists on kind of where you see the moment in terms of on this spectrum, right? When you read the New York Times, it just, some op-ed columnists think we're on the landslide towards tyranny. Others think that, you know, checks and balances are still holding and working. Curious your perspective on this, and did this come up in the index at all? Is it maybe under a different name?
I guess I would start with one observation, which I've taken some solace in, and maybe I'm overly optimistic here. And that is that the next 9 months are not going to be the same as the last 9 months. Now, that may be that we see an acceleration, but I actually believe we're in the midst of a government shutdown at the moment. We have state, local elections in under a month. And then obviously we enter the congressional election period. And I believe what we're going to start seeing is the deflation of some of that, balloon effect that Trump has been able to use to his advantage to have the free hand. You're going to see more senators and members of Congress acting in their self-interest, because just like Ted Cruz, there was a good Politico piece on this, that he's playing the long game. He's understanding that it's not a good thing for conservatives that the FCC is moderating what certain comedians are saying. And so I think we'll see more examples of this. I think the shutdown, the economy, I have taken to saying Trump has escaped political gravity, he's escaped legal gravity. I don't think he can escape economic gravity. And the White House obviously is in full spin mode about, where the tariffs are coming from and who's to blame. But when I'm going to the supermarket or I'm going to buy a new car and it is $8,000 more, I am going to feel that. I'm going to be frustrated by that. And I think that ultimately will fall on, Trump's very golden now Oval Office decor. And so for me, that is one check. Now, there is obviously this question. You've got efforts at gerrymandering, you've got counter efforts at gerrymandering here in California and elsewhere. But ultimately, I think this comes down to momentum, and that we're going to see a slow, steady erosion of momentum. And that ultimately there will be a resetting probably over the course of the next year and a half as both congressional elections ramp up, as ultimately a new Congress takes hold. And then if, as there's 21 seats that are considered competitive in the House of Representatives, if Democrats retake that, the math for Trump gets very difficult, whether it's on an oversight standpoint, whether it's from a budgetary standpoint. So that's my hope. Now, if we find ourselves a year from now and the Republicans are still riding high in the saddle, all bets are off.
I'll stick to more of the human level, and I think most Americans are much more moderate in the middle, and so the extremes in either ways, either side just don't really resonate. And so I do think people have to be selective in their listening skills and what reality is, because there's lots of talk always about what could be, but it's not going to necessarily translate to reality. So that's what gives me hope every day, is just that, hopefully there's, especially with the election cycle coming up, that moderation will have to temper some of this noise to the extremes. And I think that's the challenge in government, is the pendulum is always going to swing back and forth in response to anything. And as much as we can moderate this swing in one direction, then it'll help us on the other end.
You said there was not a single formula to position yourself and to respond to what's happening around you. But what has happened to ethics and integrity? If you're a CEO, one of the things that I think is very important to running a company is to be ethical and to show integrity and to do the right thing and decency and all of these things and justice. So is that not the advice to the CEOs? Particularly, maybe short term, doing a deal and doing a transaction, etc. But in the medium to the longer term, people, I think, like to buy or to do business with companies that behave in an ethical, in a way that is also in the interest of the public good. So, and that I think is now in short supply. If you look at, for example, the attack on, and by the way, I'm from the European Union. If you look at the attack on diversity, equality, and inclusion, that's kind of part of that's ethics. That's our kind of moral framework that people should have equal opportunities. And what's wrong with it? Diversity is good for business. Lots of studies demonstrate that if you display those behaviors, it's kind of good for society, it's good for business. So where's in all of this, these reflections and risks and reputation, etc., where's the ethical framework? Where's integrity?
I do think, the government is usually where we look to expect the guardrails, those guardrails to protect our.
Deeply personal. That's
Yes,
not, we don't
true.
look to the government to say, well, let's be ethical.
It's true, but they're normally putting out the guardrails to protect the environment, to protect health, protect, individuals, safety, security, etc. But I do agree that it's now on, these CEOs as well. It's
Show
just
leadership.
titans of leadership to show leadership. And really, I think those ethics, that's why, ethics was the third on the list, but or lack of ethics is the third on the list, because I know people want to see that kind of accountability.
And to underline that, I think the fact that ethics concerns rank so high actually reinforces the idea that while politicians or some politicians may seem temporarily to escape that ethical gravity, it's not the same in the corporate world. Consumers are still making decisions based on what they feel a company or a CEO is doing ethically or not. And I think it's a mistake for CEOs to look at the White House and say, oh, well, Trump is doing it, so I can get away with it. And so while there is certainly that atmosphere of, the laws don't apply to me, the rules don't apply to me, if you're a CEO, and look, we're only now 10 months into this term, I think we're going to start over the course of the next 6 to 9 months seeing some of those ethical decisions, actions called out. So, this is your warning if you're a CEO or a board, you want to pay attention to how you proceed with caution. And, on top of that, we are also hearing from Democrats who are running for House seats or in the House. We're going to start holding hearings on how you as companies, as well as obviously government departments and agencies, acted in this first term. So again, coming back to, you got to make sure that you're not over-indexing on one side or the other. Proceed with caution. And I agree, I don't think that the values that we saw undergirding ESG, DEI have disappeared. They're still there. Yes, there are loud calls from certain political groups and actors, but I think the broad swath of consumers still hold a lot of those
And
beliefs.
to double down on that, I mean, when I said that there's nothing formulaic, but you do still have to go to, reevaluating and reaffirming your values first and foremost, and having a basis from which to then quickly respond. And I think, you saw that with Costco. They had just certain values and they were going to defend it around DEI, and they performed in the marketplace. So nothing formulaic except for go back to your values. And usually values are lofty around, ethical choices that they're making for positive good in society.
Yeah, I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to, in such a fragmented media environment where everyone is getting very bespoke, algorithmic feeds, how do you respond if you have one of these reputational issues and you guys are advising your clients or CEOs? What, there's sort of the legacy media, which sometimes gets the headlines, but I don't have a sense that that's actually what moves the needle a lot with when you're talking about, for instance, like consumer sentiment or sort of the things that become viral. So how do you go about responding when you do get that?
So the first thing we would tell you is you've got to both own your story and you've got to put your story out there ahead of the crisis. So taking a look, whether it's your website, your YouTube channel, your social media channels, to very clearly, to Isabel's point, establish what are your values. And when we get down to some of these questions about fraud or ethics or even issues of the integrity of certain processes, we'll explain what the process is. And I think you've got to lean more into that now, precisely because it is such a heightened risk environment, because those narratives take hold so quickly. And, often when we'll go into a company, we'll say, okay, well, tell us about your process and how do you explain you work in this space? It's like, well, if you go to page 215 on this PDF, you can find it. No, if it doesn't come through in that short, sticky way, it's not going to carry the day. I come back to the example, because we did this exercise in the class at Georgetown around, okay, if you're United Airlines, and you have that situation, I don't need to even know where on my network of flights I'm going to have an issue with overbooking. I know it's an issue. So what do I need in order to engage on that discussion? We had a similar one. There was a passenger on a Delta plane from London to Atlanta, Adam Saleh. And he got pulled off a few years back because he was speaking Arabic and there was a passenger who was uncomfortable. And so they asked him to leave. Well, he essentially took a video, live streamed it. He was a YouTube influencer to his whole audience. And what does Delta do? They put out a short statement. Which one do you think carried the day? The live video or the short statement? So the point is, if I'm an airline, that's a risk for me. I want to be able to talk about, we transport millions of people of a wide range of faiths and beliefs. We have a wide range of employees with different backgrounds. So if you're able and ready to engage, and obviously check with your lawyers and make sure that, you're not putting yourself in greater legal jeopardy. But my point often is any of that informational infrastructure out there in the universe before something happens is not actually a legal liability, because all you're doing is saying, this is what we do in these processes. This is how we work. So thinking about lifting up that part of your story, because if the reporter even, and we deal with this like New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, if I'm Googling you and the first thing that pops up is that, viral video, that's the narrative. That's the story that's setting in my mind. And if you on your website, in your video channels are not telling an equally compelling story, you're losing the debate.
And, Brett's more on the communication side, I'm more on the strategic advisory, and I talked earlier about the fact that Pfizer is not defined by just this incident, it's everything else they're doing in the marketplace. And that's where I get engaged more. It's what are your products and services that you're rolling out? What is your action in community? What are you doing to demonstrate those values on an everyday basis? And I do think, that's the story that then feeds into the communications. You have to be active and authentic with the stakeholders that you want to defend yourself against when an allegation of fraud or disinformation or data breach or anything comes to your doorstep. And so I really, urge companies to take action in that direction. And as head of a government agency where we infamously don't have marketing budgets at all to really defend ourselves, you are judged by your actions and what you're able to deliver in the marketplace. And I do think that carries weight as well.
And I'll just jump in and say there are now actually AI startups, they're not there yet, but that use and they track some of these crises and use AI as a tool to figure out where the conversations are happening so that you're not necessarily completely shocked. You can watch them happen, you can monitor them before they turn into anything larger. So there is innovation in this exact space also happening, which I think is very exciting. Other questions?
Hi, my name is Lake Dai. I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon. I teach AI governance and also applied AI. So my question is, so I'm currently drafting an AI governance framework with Harvard Business School. And I'm just wondering have you see any kind of similar framework that currently in baking somewhere else that we can use as reference? Because we talk a lot about how important it is, but how we actually execute it. Particularly, we can use it as a reference for private sector.
Yeah, I mean, we just talked today more on the discriminations, which is another one of the risks around AI and its perceived discriminating capabilities. I do think that there's been past efforts. Do you remember what the title was that I told you today? But with multiple foundations, philanthropies, trying to identify, responsible AI framework. Just during the Biden administration, that was rolled out. Multiple, companies as well making commitments to continue to deliver against responsible AI. But I mean, that's one I can
I think the
share with you
partnership
later.
on AI
Mhm.
is a good group to follow.
Partnership on AI.
And this is also where I think whether it's private industry, whether it's academia or civil society, philanthropy,
Mhm.
you are starting to see, even in the absence of the federal government regulating or setting down some framework, you are starting to see we are going to adhere to certain standards. And this comes precisely back to what I was saying of like, as a company, even in these times of laissez-faire and, it's the Wild West, we want to set ourselves apart and these are the standards. And then that starts, I think, to move the needle in some direction. You also will see them in the EU, obviously, has been a leader in this, but you're also seeing states like California, that are putting down some mile markings and some regulations saying, we are going to set the standard. And if that happens, it essentially has a similar effect to the federal government, because if I want to operate in one of the biggest states in the US, I've got to adhere to these standards. And I think there's just an effect of more actors calling out. And we saw this even with like deep fakes. You're seeing how celebrities, other public figures are saying, this has gone too far. And we've got to have, more action. You've got to see, and we've talked even with tech companies about, okay, how are you monitoring and how are you controlling for this? So that is, if you will, the framework that I think is viable at this point in the absence of
Yeah,
federal.
and I do really think it's the risk monitoring, look at the response on mental health and, these recent tragic suicides of some teenagers and, industries, quick response, but I think I'd like to see more guidances in monitoring, the responsibility to monitor risk and report out and sort of foresee and stop any challenges.
Hi, Isabel from the European Union here. Maybe if I could just build on that very quickly. The EU was alluded to, but there's something called the AI Pact. If you would like to have a look at it, so that sets out a voluntary set of commitments and frameworks for private sector industry and companies in terms of what they can do internally to build out internal risk management frameworks in the absence of, as you say, more indicative federal or state types of framework. So any further questions about Europe, we're more than happy to chat. This is an area that we've done quite a bit of writing and reading about. So we're curious, of course, to see where it will go in the coming months as well.
Thanks for being here.
So I'm gonna push back a little. Ken Schott, Stanford Graduate School of Business, Professor of Political Economy. I'm gonna push back on a little bit of the idea of self-regulation being appealing for disruptive innovators here. So I'm gonna try to articulate things. I'm gonna put myself in the position of how I think some people in Silicon Valley think about disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation is all about winning. Winning is everything. That's what made Microsoft, Google, Facebook, whoever wins AI, it is winner take all. Reputational downsides do not matter at all if you don't win. If you don't win, you're dead. So reputational stuff only matters conditional on winning. So that means you should be willing to take all sorts of reputational risks along the path to winning. I'm speaking as a matter of strategy here. I teach a class on leading with balance. I don't think it's the right thing to do, but I think it's a matter of strategy. It's happening to some people. So you should be willing to push the envelope on privacy. You should be willing to push the envelope in terms of effects on users, whether you're social media or your AI or whatever. You just shouldn't care because the whole goal is to win. You should also try to use government as a lever to win. If you can kill off your competition via whatever shenanigans you do with whatever government you do it with, you do that on the path to win because winning is everything. So the question is, how would you respond to someone? I think there are people in the valley who think exactly this way. This is their way that they think about things when they're doing venture capital investments. How would you push back on that, or how would you respond to that? Are they mistaken, or are they just wrong in some moral sense and it's kind of unfortunate, or?
Well, definitely wrong in the moral sense, but I'll agree with you that, and I'm glad, I do think that the economy is evolving as well. And I still, rely on consumer sentiment, and backlash to potentially control, because you're not going to win in the marketplace if the consumers are backlashing, and especially at this time in America, because our demographics are shifting so dramatically. I think norms are going to continue to be replaced, and so I think as a matter of being able to win, you have to take into consideration more, strong sentiments of consumers who are shifting, who don't want these, massive market makers to just control and dominate. They don't want to see winners like that.
And I would push back a bit in one, it's true. I mean, we've seen Facebook, we've seen now even TikTok essentially, say, pay lip service to concerns about privacy and disinformation and those things, but in the end, what matters to me is bottom line. The problem becomes, and I do think that this is an emerging threat. It hasn't fully metastasized yet, but you're seeing examples where even large companies, Budweiser, Cracker Barrel, the likes of the NVIDIAs are finding themselves crosswise either with consumers or with the administration or a range of other groups and stakeholders. And that has revenue consequences. Does it yet rise to the level of over the long term, I'm going to change my behavior, which I think is an interesting issue to track, because right now we're saying, this is emerging. It's something that we're seeing some short-term adjustments and adversity around. Over the long term, I come back to my point, which is I don't think that we talk about it in terms of strategic reservoirs of forgivability. I think that if you play that game of, I'm going to ignore consumer concerns, I'm going to ignore a lot of these reputational risks and just plow ahead, you're ultimately creating conditions which are conducive to the next crisis. And we've seen this play out, including with some of those companies, which didn't, sink them, but it might the next time. And so if I were, advising investors, I'd say, for me, look at it through that lens of how exposed am I potentially as an investor to a company that doesn't really adjust to some of these reputational risks. Because I think in this environment, it can be quite different than what we saw before. And that ultimately could be a serious existential threat. So I may be proven wrong, but that's my thesis.
And perhaps, if it's a parallel to winning in politics and, populism has carried the day and really, transformed how parties are looking at the voting block and, having to shift as a result. I mean, maybe the same is true in our economy and corporations are going to have to, the consumers as, the populists here, might be able to finally have a say and be able to control that, who the winners are.
I would just add, I sit on 2 advisory boards of AI companies, and the sentiment and the desire to win is real, especially when you're trying to disrupt an extremely traditional space. That said, on the pathway to scale, at some point, you do need to make the shift to where you do incorporate stronger values and stronger ethics. And the cost of doing so after scale or at scale is a lot higher than it is when you're on the pathway there. So I think the fact that I'm on their advisory board might be the right answer to some degree. And I think as professors, as civil society and academia, largest part of the reason why Silicon Valley is such a hotbed for innovation is because of professors like yourself and organizations like ours that kind of come together and keep these conversations going, because those are the ideas that eventually get to the innovators. So I think it's part of the solution, not just a conversation on the side.
And I know in full disclosure, since I was a fellow at Stanford, but the Business Government Society initiative that is being thought through, I think really gets to this point as well. I mean, it's business, government, society collaborating to solve problems.
One quick follow-up on that question where you spoke about being cautious as companies being cautious about AI adoption and trying to have the infrastructure of governance, even if it doesn't exist at a federal level, try to figure out what's right as a company leadership team or as strategic board members in figuring out how AI goes forward. But I wanted to ask about the shadow AI, which doesn't really depend on company strategy or board investments or sentiments, right? Like governance is lagging behind at this point. The way AI has spread, consumers have free access to image, voice, any form of AI. Not only that, with pressures on efficiency and productivity, employees are resorting to AI whether we like it or not. That, in my mind, opens us up to a much larger gamut of reputational risk with trade secrets things that should not be out there. So I think my question is, are we erring on the side of caution and leaving employees to kind of go out on the web where we cannot monitor them and causing the larger harm than being naturally a part of this adoption and figuring out how to do it right?
I think you raised some really interesting points because I've read articles recently about like, how do you manage a team understanding that, you know, your employees may be utilizing some of these AI tools. I mean, I can tell you just at our firm as an example, for writing, it is banned to use AI. I have set that as the policy because I firmly believe, and I've had conversations with other agencies who are using AI, and they think the path to their future is through AI. And yet, you know, I continue to point out to them, most of their clients can also acquire that technology. And what's interesting about it is AI will always, at least the current version of it, will always chart a course through the middle. Well, if you're trying to communicate and convey, you know, creative, innovative ideas, that path isn't through the middle. And so I think one, it's about as leaders setting a standard and saying, you know, in this space, you may want to experiment with it on your own, in your personal life, but in this space, this is how we're going to operate. But the other, which I think raises some, you know, interesting dilemmas is, okay, there are all of these deepfakes, there are all of these ways. And quite frankly, that's what, I mean, if we get back to the risks that we truly are confronting in this time, never before. I mean, I used to say in my classes that, you know, the individual with a cell phone was the, you know, greatest risk to any brand because I could capture a photo, a video, audio. Well, now it's an individual with an AI, you know, chatbot that can essentially create in an instance. But my antidote for that, apart from the coffee, is that you do have to really double down in that environment on lifting up your story, defining your values, and defining your position, because this is a very congested, this is a very chaotic and crisis-prone space. So in my view, the answer, if you're an organization, is, all right, we've got to ensure that our story is out there and is very clear, that we have amplifiers, validators on our board or in our network who understand that, because otherwise we're going to be battling against every teenage kid with, you know, a chatbot that thinks it's, you know, a fun exercise to go after this company that, you know, they didn't like the flavor of their latest soft drink. So.
Yeah, and I do think adoption of AI is that twofold. It's not just the AI you're deploying for consumer use, but it's obviously as well AI internally. And I do think every CEO should be concerned with their employees' response to how you're rolling out AI as a tool for use internally, because they're worried about their jobs. They're worried about how you're using information internally within the company and externally in the company, outside the company as well. So I do think that those two components are really critical.
Yeah, I mean, you have to step in as a leader. I think that's the uncomfortable truth around the AI adoption piece, because you'll have organizational priorities at some point that say one thing, and then your competitive priorities will say another thing. And if you don't fill that gap of leadership, someone else will. And I think that's where, at least even at Berkeley, I mean, we have students using AI in exams, as professors having to kind of create their own guidelines around how they're going to test it. And now we have professors who actually want to encourage students to use it, given specific prompts, given specific parameters. And that's kind of the meeting in the middle of the moment. I guess one last question and then we're ready to, yes, please.
Hi, I'm Romeo Becquerel, I'm the scientific attaché to the Consul General Philly. I listen with very much care and attention the fact that a video can be extremely important both for reputation and for misleading and disinformation. I remember the time when Facebook started starting automatically the videos. The same happened also on YouTube. TikTok, I think, has been always that way. I never watched TikTok. So this has two important effects. The first one is a waste of energy, both at servers and on your laptop or mobile, which is an environmental issue. But the other one is the brainwashing of those people, because the moment you just have a fixed image, you have to click and watch the video. It's a decision. The moment you get all the videos rolling one after the other, may increase the profit of the advertisement, but certainly is a very good way to brainwash. And this can be simply regulated. There are many ways that even in this country, things are regulated to avoid waste. You go, you refuel your car, there's a pump sucking the vapors. We don't have it in Europe. It's better here. We have many other valves to prevent waste and damage. This can be implemented by regulations according to prevention of children, but just avoiding any possible automatic startup of commercials, videos, and misinformation. Because most of those videos now can be produced by AI. While in the past they were videos produced by humans, freedom of expression. What is the freedom of expression of AI? Just in the last days, this new Tilly actor came out from Denmark. So you can have a bunch of actors playing everything around and starting automatically without any accountability to humans that develop fake products, because those are machines. Who is liable?
And we talked about this earlier, also on our car ride, we had a good car ride. But I do think that's where there's more bipartisan support or interest, because when it comes to the protection of children, right? Because they're gonna automatically see those videos. Beyond that, I don't think there's much appetite for looking at regulation in that regard, but it's a leader, it's an indicator that, you know, folks are concerned when they're worried about their kids. And it's why TikTok is so addictive as well, because it just plays automatically. I mean, I see my two teenage sons on it.
Yeah, I was
nonstop.
gonna say, my concern as a parent of a 12-year-old is who spends too much time, despite our efforts, on YouTube. And to your point, you know, it's not just that he's clicking on the greatest soccer, you know, goals of all time. It's now inserting automatically something that he didn't choose, which is exposing him to things that are quite concerning. But to Isabel's point, I actually think that this is an illustration of how even in these times of deregulation, you have to zero in on, okay, what is the segment, the space that I can make some progress on? And, you know, we've seen with Marsha Blackburn, the senator from Tennessee, as well as her Democratic counterpart, Chris Murphy, going after some of these online safety issues for kids. And that's where I think you start to create some standards. And even if it's not at a federal level, I've seen, and I would encourage schools, soccer clubs saying, you know what, as a parent, I don't want your kids to be just watching unending reels of YouTube. So change the setting on your computers, on your devices, so that that isn't the case. I think we have to set those standards.
Kids are smart. Kids are smart.
Kids are smart and smarter and more technically adept, without question. But I think we have to start setting some of those standards out. And again, it may not ultimately, at least in the short term, be a legal standard. Maybe it's a social standard. Maybe it's, you know, a school standard. But you begin down that path. The other thing, just to kind of wrap up, and I know we sort of had this this tech theme to our visit out to the Bay Area for the index. In a time when artificial intelligence is on the ascendancy, and apparently now 75% of posts on LinkedIn are written by AI. I actually firmly believe that there is an additional value to things that are authentically written by humans. These are my genuine thoughts, not, you know, I don't want to exist in a space in which I'm just consuming all of this artificial information. And so, you know, if you are a company thinking about how do I protect myself, how do I promote myself in these times, owning that idea of human intelligence. And, you know, I mentioned before the strategic reservoirs of goodwill. The point of the matter is, companies are going to find themselves either because of an individual employee's action, because of a president's action, or that of a political party, going to find themselves in some sort of hot water. But the point is not, do you find yourself in that hot water? The point is then, how do I lean into that moment, Do I tell my story in an authentic way that actually, and this is the interesting thing that I've discovered about Crisis, is that the brands that do it well are able to use that moment to educate the public and to generate more loyalty. Because this actually gets to an interesting point that we found about banks and their adoption of technology as well as AI. Yes, all of us used to go into the teller and we deposit our checks and we interact with somebody. Now we just do it on a phone. Well, that's fine up until you have a problem and then you can't get in touch with somebody. And surveys have shown that trust in banks has precipitously declined. And so you think about that for a second, and I think it's a good way to wrap up the conversation. If trust in banks has precipitously declined because they all went on to the mobile app and that's how we're banking now, you gotta find a way to reinsert a human experience into that mobile app, into your relationship with your consumers. Otherwise, to my point, I think you're going to take it on the chin the next time that you have a fraudulent banking crisis or some sort of institutional issue. And so my point is, and the takeaway, if you will, is from the index, insert humanity into your technology and into your processes, and that's your best antidote apart from coffee too.
And then since we're wrapping up, I mean, what I want to go back to the origin story of the index, which you tell better, but it's basically, Brett, when he was at the NSC, had the task, and before that, the State Department had the task of in country, evaluating the landscape, evaluating the reputational risks in country and leveraging data, to be able to do that. And coming into the private sector, finding that really didn't exist as much, this index is a hope to fill that gap and actually create the same type of tool or resource that State Department, military, et cetera, any footprint of the US and any country had at their fingerprints. And I do think, especially here in the Bay Area, where, we get some great innovations that come out of defense, but and government use. But I do think that's what we have to keep in mind. This is a set of, data points for a CEO, for an organization to leverage, to assess risk and all the risks that they have to take into account on a daily basis. And it's an important resource going forward, especially as we see this convergence of technology and the speed with which messages fly around the globe, and a heated hyper-political environment.
Well, on that note, I encourage all of you to take a look at the Global Risk Index results for Q3. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Isabel, for your brilliant insights. Why don't we give it up for our panelists? All right. Now break for refreshments. Thank you.